Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 20th of May. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. On this week's show, despite the UK's impressive vaccine rollout, the Indian variant is putting next month's Freedom Day in doubt as cases have risen in Bolton, Bedford, and Blackburn. How should we respond? I'll be joined by Professor Christina Pagel, Director of UCL's Clinical Operational Research Unit. If there is a delay to unlocking on the 21st of June, how will Tory backbenchers react? Katie Balls will explain. Trade tensions created by the Brexit deal are also on the government's mind. James Forsyth interviews former Brexit negotiator David Frost in this week's magazine. Was ditching the backstop really a good idea? Then we'll look at the cover story for this week's magazine, TikTok Intifada. How is social media worsening global conflict? We'll be joined by journalist James Ball and Seth Frantzman, a Middle East analyst and journalist in Jerusalem. What is it like to be a war correspondent? We'll hear from author Judith Mackrell and CNN's Clarissa Ward. And finally, Prince Harry said the First Amendment is bonkers. Is he right, and how has that gone down? We'll hear from Freddie Gray. All that to come in the next hour. Before we get going, if you enjoy what we do on Spectator TV, then subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the button at the bottom of this video and then tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. And if you want to subscribe to the magazine, we have a special offer for you. Get 12 issues of the magazine plus a £20 Amazon voucher for just £12. If it sounds too good to be true, that's because it is. Go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to take it up. Now, first. COVID case rates in Bolton are more than 10 times the English average. In Bedford, more than 6. The Indian variant of COVID has been rising in these areas, leading to fears that the UK could go the way of India, which saw a surge of cases resulting in the dwindling of medical supplies and hospitals being overrun. It's this new strain which is thought to have contributed to the virus getting out of control, with outstanding questions about its transmissibility, although of course problems with India's vaccine rollout have played a major role as well. So the question today is, could that happen here? And are we going to see the UK's long-awaited Freedom Day put on hold? To discuss, I'm joined now by UCL's Professor Christina Pagel. Christina, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. We've gotten a sense over the past 24 to 48 hours that the Prime Minister and his officials think concerns over the Indian variant may have been a false alarm, but you disagree.
I don't think we know yet whether it was a false alarm or not. Certainly, cases are still going up quite significantly. The latest data from the UK COVID Genetics Consortium, which sequences data here, shows that it's about 35% of all cases now sequenced is this new variant. The Wellcome Sanger data, which was released on Monday, which updates weekly and just takes community cases, so removes cases from travel and surge testing, are up to 28% of cases. So there's no doubt that it's been going up. Now, the question is growth slowing? Are the measures that they put in place working? And as we get more cases, do we get a better handle on how much more transmissible it is? And it is very sensitive to it. So I think there is agreement that it's more transmissible than the dominant, what's called the Kent variant in the UK. But it's kind of, if it's only 10% more, then there probably won't be a big issue this summer, but if it's 50% more, there could be a really big issue. So until we pin that down, I think it's too early to say whether it's a false alarm.
So I've seen figures that say that the Indian variant is roughly 20% of the cases across England. There you cited 35. If it were significantly transmissible, or if we were in danger of seeing exponential growth, why wouldn't this be reflected in the national data, when actually it remains the case that we're around 97% below the peak of cases and deaths 99% below the peak?
Yeah, so that 20% figure comes from the COG, the COVID Genetics Consortium website, but that's over the last 2 weeks. And so 2 weeks ago, it was 15% and then it went up to 30%. So that's kind of the average of both of them. So over the last week, it has gone up further. The reason cases have still been going down is because the dominant variant, so the Kent variant, that has been declining. And so effectively, you've had two epidemics. You've had one where cases are going down and one which, starting from much smaller numbers, is going up. And that's masking the rise of the Indian variant. We saw exactly the same thing in Europe in January and February when our variant was becoming dominant there and the old variant was dying out, that actually cases were coming down even while the Kent variant was increasing. So the question is can we delay the increase of this variant long enough and vaccinate enough people so that we can actually continue opening or not? And I don't think we know that yet. So we're not yet at the situation where this variant is dominant in England. And until it is, you wouldn't expect it to start driving overall numbers.
But we have the vast majority of the most vulnerable in the UK vaccinated. We now have 34, 35-year-olds getting vaccinated. Well over 20 million people have their second jab. So in terms of those who would have been vulnerable last year when the circumstances were different, we're in very different territory now. And cases are still at rock bottom, hospitalizations, deaths as well. What's the reason for not pushing ahead with opening up?
Well, it's certainly truth. I mean, the vaccines are great. And if we didn't have the vaccine program, we would be in a situation that India is facing right now, or Nepal is facing right now, where they're seeing, terrible surges and hospitals overfilling and people dying on the streets. Now, we're not in that situation, and that is because of our vaccine program. But if you have a variable, and this is what the SAGE modelling subgroup shows, this is, the government's own scientific advisors show that if you have a variant that is 50% more transmissible, even if the vaccines work just as well as they do now, even if you have really high uptake, which we do, that's all in the model, you can still get to a situation where you overwhelm hospitals. And that's just because if you have an incredibly large number of people infected, even a tiny percentage that then gets sick, and the vaccines aren't perfect, even 3-4% is still enough to create stress on the NHS. Now, if it's just 20 or 30% more transmissible, you're not going to see that level. So that's kind of why it's really, really important that we pin down exactly how much more transmissible it is.
And we're told that we're going to have that data in the coming weeks. But one of the issues that we have had over the course of the pandemic is that a lot of the modeling that's taken place within SAGE, within government, has been based on worst case scenarios. And the lab data and real world data that we continue to get shows that the vaccines are far more effective than often the modeling takes into account. I know that you've been quite cautious and nervous about the reopening that's taken place so far, and certainly around the 21st of June. But if all the data continues to point in the right direction, would there be any reason not to go ahead with it?
So firstly, the latest SAGE modellings are not based on worst case scenarios. They use up-to-date data from Public Health England and the latest published information in the New England Journal and the Science, in Science on vaccine efficacy. They assume very, very high vaccine efficacy that comes directly from our data. They assume very high vaccine uptake, which comes directly from our data. And it's because that data is better than was expected in February and March that their models are actually showing a much more limited surge. So under the Kent variant, if we didn't have this new variant, their models are showing actually we probably would be fine to open this summer because they're using actual real data. They're not modelling a worst case scenario right now. Now, the new variant does change things. If it comes to 3 weeks' time and cases are still going down overall, then yes, I think we're in a situation where you can say, okay, the new variant turned out not to be as bad as we feared. We're in a position where we can open further, but we don't know that yet because we're not there yet. So that's all I'm saying. I'm saying, we can't promise where we're going to be in a few weeks because that data is not here yet.
Well, I don't think anyone can promise anything over the course of this pandemic. We know that the virus continues to surprise us. But as we're not expected to do the next phase of reopening until the 21st of June, where do you really differ from the government's projected timelines and policies for reopening?
Well, did I say I differed? What I differ in is saying that we can put a date on it, and that I don't think we should say that the 21st of June is a special date and that if we miss it, it's a big disaster. I think where I differ most on are two things. One is international travel and our border policy. So, we saw that in January and February, we were very focused on the Brazilian and the South African variants, the variants that were discovered there. And we kind of had a red list and thought that would keep them out. And we certainly have controlled those variants in the UK. They're at very, very low levels. And then it turned out that the next dangerous variant came from India. We don't know where the next dangerous variant is coming from. COVID is still running rampant in many countries across the world. And many of them don't sequence. Right? And so it's not until too late that we understand that there's a new variant that's arisen. So I think this summer, while we're still trying to finish vaccinating our population, is not the right summer to have international travel and risk new importations. The other thing...
You say it's a dangerous variant, but the evidence hasn't quite held that up yet. I mean, all of the lab and real world data that we're getting about the variant would suggest that vaccines hold up against it. And COVID has mutated many of thousands of times. So at what point do you think it would be safe to open up the borders more and to resume some kind of normal international travel? Is it about vaccination numbers? Is it about COVID levels?
When I said that it is dangerous because it is more transmissible. And that makes it harder to keep COVID under control. There's no doubt that even if it's just 10% more transmissible, we would be in a better position if it wasn't here. I mean,
well, indeed, we'd be in a much better position if we don't
have the final evidence. Like the deputy chair of JCVI, the government's vaccination subcommittee, he said that actually it does resist the vaccines more than the Kent variant. Now, it seems to protect against severe illness, but you can get sick and you can pass it on if you're vaccinated. Now, what that means is that it makes it more transmissible, right? Because it means that you can pass it on even if you don't personally get sick. We don't know what impact that will have on long COVID. We don't know if it will mutate further, given the opportunities here. So I think saying that any new variant that is fitter than the last variant is a dangerous occurrence is true. Most mutations don't become fitter, they die out. This one is not dying out. It's dominating in India, it's dominating in Nepal. In every country it's been discovered, it's growing rapidly. So it's the next Kent variant, if you like. Now, if we're lucky, it won't be fit enough to overcome our vaccination program.
COVID is a dangerous virus, variants included, but we now see that cases are decelerating or even declining in the major outbreaks in the UK. Cases also appear to be leveling off in India. To go back to that original question, given the fact that we may be living with variants for years to come and indeed indefinitely, at what point would you say you think we can start to resume some normality when it comes to international travel and perhaps some of those bigger decisions around large-scale events and the complete removal of social distancing, if this is something we're likely to have to live with for a long time?
I would like us to follow Israel's example, where they only opened up once they'd fully vaccinated. And we're only about 35% fully vaccinated of adults. Fully vaccinated, about 75-80% of all adults in Israel, and they're now vaccinating adolescents. And they're the only country that's actually achieved control of COVID to almost zero levels through vaccination. Other countries with high vaccination rates are still seeing a lot of outbreak because they haven't got to that level yet. And Israel closed its borders entirely while it was doing its vaccination program, and even now has quite strict border controls, and even now still asks people to wear masks inside and has masks inside schools. But they are reaping the benefits because they've managed to open their economy almost entirely without seeing any kind of resurgence of COVID. So that's what I would like to see. I'd like to see us get to a stage where we have vaccinated maybe 80-85% of all adults fully, and have a plan for how we potentially boost against variants and vaccinate adolescents. And that should be by September. It's not that far away, right? And I think, so for me, 2022, let's open. Right? That's fine. We'll know a lot more about variants. We'll have new vaccines. Most of our population will be protected. We hopefully will be at least near the threshold where you can rely on population immunity to keep new outbreaks low and contained. So that's how I see it.
When you say let's open, obviously the opening process is phased. Would you, in your ideal scenario, be rolling back some of the reopening we've done? Would you pause it here? Or would you just continue to follow the data in whichever direction it took us?
I think I'd follow the data. I mean, at the moment, if it was up to me, I would have delayed Monday's reopening by a few weeks until we actually did know more about this variant. Now I think it's too late to roll it back. But I'll be watching the data really carefully. And if it turns out it's fine, then okay, then we keep going. I'm not saying that in falling cases we should have more restrictions. But I do think that the data is there to be concerned right now, and there are perfectly reasonable explanations for why we're not seeing an overall increase, because we don't have this variant being dominant yet. And we're in a situation where one variant's falling and the other variant's going up, and they haven't overtaken each other yet.
Back in early April, you also warned about the 12th of April reopening, telling The Independent that we are seeing the same things we saw last year, and in the autumn, none of the fundamentals have changed. But of course, we saw schools reopen, shops, outdoor hospitality, more households mixing outdoors. Of course, it's too early to say what the 17th of May reopening is going to do, but we just have not seen that national surge in infection, hospitalizations, or death. The opposite, in fact. So would you agree that now that the fundamentals have changed and that they are looking more positive?
I never said that we were going to have a surge in infections and hospitalizations from that reopening. And in fact, the SAGE models from February and March said that the dangerous step was the step we've just taken in May, not the one in April. What I said
was that there had been an increase. I
said that there have been an increase in cases in March in schools. We haven't seen that to date since April, and I suspect that's because community transmission actually did drop a lot over Easter, which is really good news. And we were quite lucky in that we had quite nice Easter weather, so people could go outside. But we are now seeing where cases are going up. So in Bolton, cases in school-aged children are higher than they've ever been in the pandemic. They're at over 500 cases per 100,000 per week. So it's not the case that everything's always fine. We're talking about the fundamentals, what hasn't changed is that even now, people are being asked to do rapid tests, that people are being asked to test themselves all the time, but there's no real support for you if you test positive. There's very little financial support and so little financial incentive for people to get tested if they can't afford to then isolate at home. And it's also very disruptive to your life, to caring responsibilities, to school. And so we are seeing that in disadvantaged communities, they are less likely to come forward for testing and less likely to isolate and have high rates of COVID through exposure, through work and poorer housing. So we are seeing that there is this disparity between more well-off areas and less well-off areas. And so what worries me then and worries me now is that actually what we'll see is that COVID becomes a disease that's very associated with poverty and disadvantage. And I think that could be avoided by providing more support to those communities.
I suppose the difficult thing is that lockdowns, regardless of what you think of them, level down in the most serious sense. And we know that they affect the poor and the disadvantaged the most. And it just comes down to that very difficult trade-off, doesn't it, about protecting people from the virus. You mentioned children there, but also, of course, the 20,000 children that we know have dropped out of school since lockdowns hit.
Yeah, I mean, like no one thinks lockdown is a good idea. And through good public health measures, you should be able to avoid lockdowns. Now, when you get a situation where the virus is increasing exponentially, that we had in December, for instance, and that India's just had and other countries just had, and you have a situation where your hospitals are overwhelmed, and an independent report that came out yesterday said that actually, yes, the NHS was overwhelmed in January. It means that no one can access care in the way that you would want them to access. Now, that disrupts your economy. It disrupts people's lives. If you feel like I'm not in a position to be able to get care if I get sick, it's going to restrict your behaviours. And so you do then end up having to have these lockdowns. And the more it gets out of control, the longer you have to lock down for to get cases back down again. Whereas if you prevent cases going up in the first place, it's much more effective. And that's been, my advice the whole time is if you actually did, for instance, support people to isolate, then effectively all you're doing is locking down people most likely to have COVID for a short period of time and letting the rest of the economy carry on. But we've never really done that. So we've ended up kind of opening and in the cycle of restrictions and no restrictions, restrictions and no restrictions. I don't think that's optimal health policy, and I never have. But I do think that when you have a virus that goes out of control and overwhelms your hospitals and your healthcare, and actually affects the disadvantaged communities much more, who had rates of COVID, twice, 3 times the most advantaged areas and suffered much more death and disability from it, that's a problem and you have to deal with it.
Christina, thank you for joining Spectator TV. Now, before we get into our next segment, a reminder that you can subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure you never miss an episode of Spectator TV. Click the button at the bottom of this video and then tap the bell icon to make sure you don't miss out. Now to discuss the government's thinking on the Indian variant, I'm joined by Katie Bowles, our Deputy Political Editor, and James Forsyth, our Political Editor. Katie, in this week's politics column for the magazine, you shed light on the debate taking place in government over the 21st of June reopening. Talk us through it.
So I think there had been a point last week when there was a sense in Number 10 that they were preparing for a good news announcement to be next week, that the June 21st easing would go ahead. But this plan was derailed by a rise in community transmission of the Indian variant, as it's been to be known of COVID in parts of the northwest, including Bolton. Since then, the Prime Minister won't publicly be drawn on whether that date will go ahead, and you've got plenty of sage scientists happy to fill the airwaves with concerns, and also some anonymous briefings coming out, one suggesting, as revealed by Robert Peston on Coffee House, that the chances of all restrictions going now by the June 21st is ultimately close to nil. What's really going on? Well, I think what's interesting is speaking to people in government, the strong consensus is that no one really knows what's going on. And that means that I think going forward, we have a situation where the Prime Minister, I think, is quite keen to press on if you can. I think that in recent days, actually numbers have been fairly assured or calmed by some of the data coming in, that perhaps the Indian variant isn't as transmissible as first seen, and they will be able to press on. But we're not going to know for sure, I think, for several weeks, but we should have, I think, an indicator by next week as to whether this really is looking like it's going to shape up to be a big problem, or so long as things keep going this way, things should be okay in terms of the easing.
You mentioned some positive data there. You say in the column that Boris Johnson himself thinks that the scientists might be overly worried. Yet, over the course of the pandemic, the Prime Minister tends to follow their lead, albeit later than they would often like. Do you think pressure is mounting?
Yes, and I think we have seen that pattern, which is why you have to take it with a pinch of salt if the Prime Minister is, insisting it's going to go ahead, and he's not even doing anything as bold as that. But we are in a different place now in terms of the vaccination programme, and I think what's interesting is speaking to ministers and Tory MPs. I think it's very difficult politically for the Prime Minister to push back June 21st or even water it down in a major way if the vaccines work. If the vaccines work, I think there is little political space for him. And so far, everything is suggesting they do work against the Indian strain. So I think unless we start to see the data going in an obviously bad way, which is a link to hospital admissions, I think he's going to come under a lot of pressure from both his cabinet, not everyone in his cabinet, but I would say a large chunk of them, and particularly his parliamentary party to press ahead. Given that the government has made so much of its vaccine programme, they see it as, one of the few things they did right in this pandemic. I've had MPs say to me that were they to now delay things, it would be snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. The thing to look out for, however, is that there may now be a push to get your various changes in on the COVID plan. I think one strong push is on international travel. So ministers, I think including Matt Hancock, believe that clamping down on international travel even more will help maintain domestic freedom.
We'll come back to the cabinet and their thoughts, but James, first, what are the government's options around the 21st of June? Is there a scenario where they can credibly claim Freedom Day, but realistically there's still a lot of restrictions in place?
Yeah, so I think all the focus on the date of the 21st of June misses the fact that you can have two very different types of the 21st of June. One type of the 21st of June sees the working from home guidance go, masks go everywhere but public transport, and crucially the 1 metre rule go, allowing pubs and restaurants to operate at kind of full capacity. Another version of June 21st is much more cautious. You keep the 1 metre rule, so that's table service only in pubs, restaurants not full. You still require masks everywhere where they are currently required, and you carry on encouraging people to work from home and avoid public transport if they can. I mean, there is a spectrum of options for June 21st. I would agree with Katie's analysis. I think that at the end of last week, I think there was a sense almost that the best the government could hope for was that kind of latter version of June 21st. So the limit on numbers might go, but all of these other restrictions would remain in place. I think there is now beginning to be some very sotto voce, cautious optimism that they might be able to get closer to that kind of first version of June 21st. I think that's partly because the early signs are that the vaccines don't lose efficacy against the Indian variant. And also that I think people in Whitehall are watching the hospital data from places like Bolton, like Hawks, and at the moment they are not seeing that the increase in cases there is filtering through into an increase in hospitalisations, which would suggest that the vaccine has done its job, and particularly the vaccination of the vulnerable has done its job in breaking the link between cases and hospitalizations. There's also a sense that while the Indian variant is rising quickly, surge testing was sent to a whole slew of more local authority areas on Wednesday. The initial worry was that it might be up to 50% more transmissible. I think the sense now is that the number is probably quite a bit below that. Now, if it dropped back down to 20% more transmissible than the Kent variant, for example, that would lead a narrow path open to getting to that more genuine Freedom Day of June 21st.
James, COVID isn't the only thing on the government's mind. For the magazine this week, you interviewed David Frost, former Brexit negotiator and now Cabinet Office Minister responsible for handling the European Union. How's that going?
Well, I don't think anyone could describe UK-EU relations as good at the moment. Earlier this month, you had kind of Royal Navy ships scrambled to a fishing dispute off Jersey, and the Northern Ireland Protocol is obviously a kind of constant tension between the UK and the EU. I think David Frost in this interview was trying to say to the EU, if we can't get some of the things we want, we are prepared to trigger Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which allows one side to unilaterally set the protocol aside. I was very struck how he talked about how the trade boundary, which is his description of the so-called border in the Irish Sea, has had more of a trade, more of a chilling effect than expected, and has created more diversion of trade than expected. That use of the phrase diversion of trade, I think, is important because that is one of the reasons the sides can give for triggering Article 16 of the protocol, which allows one side to unilaterally set it aside.
Finally, Katie, sticking on trade, there have been issues this week with one of the UK's flagship post-Brexit trade deals with Australia. What's happening there?
Yes, we are seeing a return of what I think have now quite widely known as the Waitrose protectionists in Cabinet against the free marketeers, perhaps the little free marketeers. And this is ultimately Liz Truss, who is the International Trade Secretary. I think her department are fairly close to signing off on an Australia trade deal. But certain forces in the Cabinet, and certainly the Farmers Union, do not like the idea of Australian meat coming into the UK market, and there is now getting kicked back. Within Cabinet, this is Michael Gove and George Eustace, the Environment Secretary, who are the ones opposing, and David Frost, who we've just been talking about, is one of Liz Truss's allies. This has led to a general row about, what is the UK's aim with Brexit? Is it free trade deals? In which case, the Australia trade deal, I think, is one that you would need to do. If you can't do an Australia trade deal, it's hard to see what other ones really you would do with this free trade agenda. Or is it to protect farmers' interests? I think one of the things making it slightly harder for Number 10 is the fact that those pushing against this deal are saying it would particularly hurt farmers in Wales and Scotland. So that would be an issue because it would damage the union. But generally speaking, I think that when it comes to the Prime Minister and Number 10, they lean more towards the Truss camp. They're quite supportive. Boris Johnson does think that one of the main reasons for Brexit was to push for free trade deals. And therefore, I think it's more likely than not that she will come through victorious in this one, and the trade deal will be more to her liking than those on the other side.
And James, when it comes to the standoff of the Waitrose protectionists, you've written on Coffee House this week that there are national security implications to this as well, as it relates to China. Can you explain?
Yeah, China became Australia's largest trading partner. But then when the Australian government started calling for an independent inquiry into the origins of coronavirus, the Chinese tried to use that economic relationship to kind of pressure Australia to take a different stance. And that's resulted in huge tariffs being slapped on Australian wine and barley, bureaucratic reasons given for not accepting Australian beef or Australian timber. And so I think for the UK to not do a trade deal with Australia in these circumstances would make a mockery of the UK's claims to be trying to encourage, democratic solidarity against Beijing. And I also think that, the global message sent if the UK can't do a trade deal with a fellow Anglophone country would be pretty poor. I also think some of the concerns about farmers are overblown because, even if you think that Australian meat imports to China have taken a permanent hit from this dispute, that the Asian market for meat, with the rise of the Asian middle class, is still growing rapidly, and beef commands a higher price in Asia than it does here. I also think that, and so I think that's where Australian farmers will continue to concentrate on exporting. Indeed, if you are talking about who is potentially most at risk from this deal, it is probably the Irish, who export over half of their beef production to the UK and generally dominate the cheaper end of the market. That is probably the exports that are threatened, because they would now, if this deal went through in the form that Liz Truss wants, they would now having to compete with the Australians on kind of level terms. And I don't think, considering where the normal price point at which British beef is competing, that this deal is the threat that people think it is. I also think that the UK wants to do a deal with New Zealand, who are going to have a similar issue, but I think it is really worth noting that even today, New Zealand does not send the UK its full tariff quota allowance of lamb. So I think the idea that this country is about to be flooded with cheap Australian and New Zealand meat is massively overdone.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Katie. Now to the cover story of this week's magazine, TikTok Intifada. Journalist James Ball is the author of the piece, arguing that social media is inflaming international tension. In the Israel-Palestine conflict, for instance, videos shared on TikTok encourage violence and spread disinformation. James joins me now with Seth Frantzman, a Middle East analyst and journalist based in Jerusalem. James, in this week's cover piece, you say that TikTok and social media inflame global conflict. The most recent example of this violence is in Israel and Palestine. What role has it played there?
I think for a while we've known that there's the potential for social media to inflame sort of ongoing tensions just through making them just through making them more visible and sort of really evoking emotions. Obviously, if people can see firsthand the aftermath of an attack or something like that, it really gives the immediacy. What we're seeing sort of move into it that's a bit new and a bit escalating is that sort of in the run-up to the tensions that led to the sort of latest bout of conflict in Gaza, was there seemed to be a TikTok trend around assaulting visibly Jewish people. There was quite a viral video of a man being assaulted by two teenagers on public transport. And these sort of challenges against a sort of already tense backdrop seem to really add fuel to the fire in country. And then what's happened as the conflict sort of broken out is even people who don't seek out anything on Israel-Palestine, who've never thought about the issue, who've never engaged with it, suddenly see it in their TikTok feeds, in their Twitter feeds, on Facebook. And it really sort of escalates things. It makes it harder for either side to back down, even if they wanted to.
James, why is TikTok becoming the popular place to share this horrible kind of thing? You can post videos on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, so why is this the platform?
It's difficult to sort of say. I don't think it is the only one. I think this is happening on every platform, but TikTok's the new one and the one that has the youngest user base. And so it's often people's introduction to politics. It also seems to be sort of perhaps the most tilted in one direction. You can sort of go quite quickly on TikTok on its discovery page from looking at what you would usually do. And it's got lots of, diet pill type stuff. It's got inspirational baking. It's got makeup tutorials. And you could jump to that to then suddenly a very jarring sort of depiction of violence in Gaza. Just because of what's working on the content and the strange way its algorithm works. I think one thing that's become notable on TikTok is its Jewish users now just cannot escape the issue. In a way that's really kind of not okay. People who have no connection to Israel, have never lived in Israel, have never sort of expressed support for the actions of Israel's government and are doing a video about something totally unrelated, will just find that all of their reactions and responses are free Palestine. Just as we don't think it's acceptable to hold, say, a British Muslim accountable for what the state of Saudi Arabia does, there really is problems inherent in that kind of response. And we are seeing quite a lot of that on TikTok.
Seth, you're in Jerusalem. Can you give us an update on what's happening right now?
Yeah, I think there is an attempt now to achieve a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, but there has also been, so far, I think by day 11, a total of 4,000 rockets fired, and there was an attack on a bus this morning, a military bus near the Gaza Strip by an anti-tank missile, and we've had sirens around the Gaza Strip and I think up into Ashkelon. So it does appear that, Hamas will try to continue firing rockets and achieve attacks right up until whatever ceasefire is broken, so that they can claim that they kind of won. And I think that's what we'll see. There has been a relatively, let's say, quiet 8 or 10 hours, and I don't think there's been a lot of airstrikes by Israel as well. So it remains to be seen if by Friday the conflict may end.
Seth, what we're seeing on social media is a growing but not necessarily new phenomenon. Can you talk to us about the history of social media in Middle East conflicts? I know it was used notably in the 2011 Arab Spring, for example.
I mean, I think that social media certainly helped to transform the Middle East in terms of giving lots of people, a decade and a half ago, a lot more of a voice, average people. I think, though, there was a change, after the Arab Spring in which you also saw a lot of social media used by ISIS and extremists. So that, I remember back in 2014, people were just publishing beheading videos and stuff. People were putting the most graphic content on. And they say that when Twitter and Facebook went to remove pro-ISIS accounts, they had to remove millions of them. So there was a huge amount of extremist content. So actually, what was supposed to be a positive thing for people to, protest against authoritarian regimes actually became, instead of something that helps people or achieves coexistence, I would say that it helped to radicalize large numbers of people. And actually, it enabled something like 50,000 people from around the world to come join ISIS, because they were able usually to coordinate initially on social media, and then they were able to use other things like WhatsApp or whatever. But that's how many of them, it seemed to be able to actually physically were able to come. So I think that is a very bad phenomenon. You could almost argue that the explosion in the use of social media helped to contribute to the ISIS genocide. And I think that if you go back to the era of bin Laden, remember he used to produce like tapes and stuff that were handed out one-to-one, You can't radicalize as many people if you're distributing tapes. You can do it a lot faster if you're using a platform that gives you access to billions of people. So I think that unfortunately we've seen that social media in a strange way radicalized and made people more sectarian. And now, of course, the big organizations or corporations that run it have tried to then, I think in a kind of arbitrary, ham-handed manner, try to cut off little pieces here and here. Like, let's get rid of ISIS accounts. Let's get rid of the radical right. That's fine. But there isn't a lot of a systematic thought put into it. And I think we've come to a point now where even states in the region, like Turkey or other places, will try to get the companies actually to remove content that they don't agree with, or they pass laws, for instance, that will make it so you, for instance, can't post certain things if you're in certain countries. I think that is unfortunately turning us into a bit of an Orwellian world. So it's totally the opposite of what we thought social media was going to be doing. But that also is, kind of the onus, I guess, is on the average person, because it's a Hobbesian world. People are not necessarily good. So social media, in some ways, just catered to the loudest, worst voices, because we're generally used to the fact that the average, normal, nice person just doesn't have a megaphone. So I think that that's something we saw a lot in the Middle East, unfortunately.
James, can you talk us through the psychology of posting these videos to social media in the first place? You would think that posting such a graphic, horrible video to a platform like TikTok would lose you support, not help you gain support.
I think there's sometimes sort of the shock of the new. People want to feel engaged. People might not want to watch a traditional news show, but, I think Gen Z gets quite patronised if people suggest they're not into news or they're only into minor stuff. And so part of it is a desire to sort of show that you're taking things seriously, but also the sort of key tone of a good social post, as well as kind of tugging on emotions, is trying to sort of explain something that the mainstream isn't telling you. Now, that can often be the full-on conspiratorial QAnon stuff that we tend to see on Facebook, actually, and YouTube more than TikTok. But it can also be a, hey, but what they're not telling you is this was actually a colonial settlement to do X, Y, or Z. And that sort of, networked, informal kind of thing sort of helps pull people in. It helps sort of build a community. It helps get a bit of credo. People like to feel knowing. And so it sort of does appeal to people. It's, it's a good cause. It's a good protest cause. And sort of young adults in every generation have always wanted those. And of course, it does attach to a real serious political movement. It's just often the way social introduces people to it can be quite strange. And it should be said, there is quite a lot of outright misinformation on actually pro-Israel and pro-Palestine accounts. People reusing old videos, people kind of knowingly misleading, including some people tied to ministries. So it's really a mess out there.
Seth, finally, to follow on from James's point, and point you were making before when you were saying that actually in many ways in the past social media has been used as a force for good, how do you weigh it up now with these kinds of videos going around with the disinformation? Do you think social media has been a force for good when it comes to political matters?
I don't know if it's necessarily a force for good, but I mean, it's a force. It's a medium, right? I mean, I don't know if radio or TV or print media have always been a force for good. I mean, it's a nature of a platform. So I just think it exists. I think that it can do good. I think when you have a conflict, you obviously tend to then emphasize all the worst attributes of things, because obviously, the worst scenes of children being killed or what have you are going to be posted, even if they're fake, but it doesn't matter. That's the kind of thing that's going to be passed around. But I think, look, after the Abraham Accords last year, when there was peace between Israel and some of the Gulf states, social media played a huge role, I think, in terms of, among a small group of people, of posting, stories about coexistence and Hanukkah and joint shared holidays. So, it can also be a place that lots of people meet. I mean, I think that's one positive aspect. So when there is a kind of positive wind blowing of peace and things like that, then you can see it definitely as a force for good. So I think it also just depends maybe on what kind of controversy or what kind of political climate there is at the time.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Seth. So what is it like to actually report from the front line of a conflict? Clarissa Ward is CNN's chief international correspondent and has covered places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. She joins me now alongside Judith Mackrell, author of Going with the Boys, a book tracking the lives of 6 female war correspondents as they reported on the Second World War. Judith, Clarissa, thank you for joining me on Spectator TV. Judith, your book, Going with the Boys, gives insight into the experiences of female correspondents reporting from the front lines of World War II. What was their experience like?
Well, like any war correspondents dealing with conflicts today, it was a mix of extraordinary exhilaration, extraordinary terror, boredom and frustration. But for these women too, it was a very particular era, because as well as battling with all the issues of being on the front line, they were also actually having to battle to earn the right to report in the first place. Because certainly at the outbreak of World War II, all women journalists were expected to report from the home front and essentially to do soft women's stories about hospitals, about evacuation shelters, about women working in munitions factories. They weren't expected to be right in the middle of the thick of battle. And the struggles that they fought to both get the military, to persuade the military and their press editors to give them permission to report, was essentially very much central to their experience. But as I write, I think the fact that for several years they had to use their own ingenuity, Martha Gellhorn, for instance, riding stowaway on a hospital ship in order to cover the D-Day landings, because women were not allowed, it often meant that they had a very different colour and a very different heartbeat to their stories.
Clarissa, to compare and contrast, what is it like today?
I mean, it's so interesting hearing Judith talk about that, because you see how much progress has been made, an extraordinary amount. There are a huge number of women like myself on the front lines doing this kind of reporting. And I think for the most part, we are treated with equality. And sometimes I even think we have an advantage. In some conservative societies, for example, we're able to get to places that our male colleagues can't get to. And we're able to sit down with women in their part of the house and tell their stories as well, which is a real privilege and something that's been absolutely lacking from the sort of broader coverage of war, particularly in conservative Muslim societies, for many, many years. So I do think a lot has changed. I don't think it's always completely changed. I do think that there are still elements of misogyny and sexism, and I do think that you face unique threats as well, potentially in conflict zones as a woman. But I am heartened to hear how far I think we've come. And I'm also, I think, like many other female war correspondents, profoundly inspired by the legacy of those women who Judith describes.
I was so interested when you said that it was easier often to get the stories of women from these conflict zones as a woman. But also, I think my women in World War II often found it was easy to get stories from the men, that the soldiers would maybe confide things to them about, maybe their more private hopes and fears and terrors. And also that because they often assumed that perhaps women didn't know so much about gun.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's such a funny point. It's one that I've made before as well, which is that sometimes as women, I used to joke that it's a wonderful thing to be underestimated, right? Often we're underestimated, but also we're often seen as less of a threat. And whether that's me just pretending to be asleep as I go through a checkpoint or whatever it might be, it has been helpful to have a woman. And you have hit on a really essential point, which is that because you're seen often as being less threatening, men are often more likely to open up to you. And I've particularly found that to be the case when I've been dealing with militants or jihadists, like doing the ISIS story. I was able to get interviews and get to the sort of the nub of the sort of personal element of what was going on with some of these Western jihadis in a way that my male colleagues really struggled to, because I was able to also sit there and chat with them about, like, what's your sister up to? Like, well, how's your wife doing? And just have these more human conversations and not be seen automatically as you're a mercenary, you're a spy, you're a government soldier.
Judith, did you find similarities in the women that you profiled? They must have all been incredibly courageous. You mentioned Sigrid Schultz, who attended Joseph Goebbels' propaganda screenings, but was secretly Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, they were all insanely brave and insanely ambitious too. I think they came to the war maybe from different motivations. Sigrid Schultz, certainly, who'd been in Berlin since 1913 and loved the city and was utterly horrified by what was happening under the Nazi regime. For her, continuing to remain in the city and to report on everything for the Chicago Tribune, risking threats of interrogation and worse, that for her, that was a hugely moral crusade. I think for Martha Gellhorn too, writing about the war from the point of view of the suffering victims, the injustice of the fascist powers, that for her thought that if she could change public opinion, if she could change the world, that justified every single word that she wrote. For some of the others, for instance, Claire Hollingworth, it was more a sense of competitiveness, the absolute adrenaline of the scoop, getting to the headlines first, that essentially drove her. And for someone like Virginia Coles, who was a kind of hilariously rogue operator, because for years she would turn up in trenches in high-heeled shoes and lipstick. for her, it was as much curiosity. She was just thrilled to be seeing the world, thrilled to be expanding her own horizons. So within that essential ambitiousness, they had different motives. But interestingly too, although they would give each other loyal support and friendship when their paths crossed, they didn't care to be seen as a sort of professional sisterhood. Because they were such a minority out in the field and having to battle so hard to be taken as seriously as men, they were quite reluctant to be presented as a kind of suffering minority. They looked out for each other, but they were very much solo operators.
Clarissa, last question to you. I'd like to hear what you think on this. What qualities are needed to be a war reporter?
I think the first quality that's needed, honestly, is curiosity. You have to be really curious. You have to be a good listener, because you have to be willing to hear things that you're uncomfortable with, that challenge your own value systems. And you have to be willing to give everyone a fair shake and hear them out and try to understand any given conflict from all different perspectives. So that can really challenge us, and particularly the way we think nowadays. We sometimes think that listening is a weakness, and that it means you're sort of conceding the moral high ground. And then the other thing I would say is that it does take resilience, and I don't mean, and I hesitate to say bravery, because I really don't think of myself as being brave. But a big part of what we don't talk about when we talk about covering war, although Judith, sort of alluded to it there, is there's a lot of killing time and boredom and waiting for things to happen and sleeping in rough spots and not having proper food while you're hoping that this operation is going to get started, or the group that you're with is going to get mobilized, or you're waiting for permissions. And that's the kind of, when you're in the sort of heady excitement of the moment, you'd be surprised how strong people can be, and they can see and experience a lot and get through it. The tough times sometimes to really get through are those sort of endless, I remember sitting on helipads for like 48, 72 hours sometimes in Iraq in 42-degree heat, waiting for a chopper to take you out to the operation that you were trying to cover. And so, yeah, if you're a picky eater, or if you're super impatient, and you struggle with that kind of stuff, then it's probably not the career for you.
One of the qualities that Claire Hollingworth always prized herself on was being able to sleep anywhere.
Yes.
And there was a wonderful image of her setting off to cover the Italian invasion of Greece in 1940. And she arrives at a station in the middle of nowhere. There's a 14-hour wait for the train. There's one other journalist, a guy who's kind of complaining away, and Claire just takes a swig of whiskey and lies down on the cold stone platform and sleeps for 14 hours. And, that, as you say, it's that ability to just ride out these really bleak, tedious periods that I think made her, in a way, the most doggedly successful of the 6 women in my book.
Thank you, Clarissa, and thank you, Judith. The First Amendment in America enshrines freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and the press. But speaking on a podcast last week, Prince Harry said that as he sort of understood it, it was bonkers. I'm joined now by the Spectator's deputy editor, Freddie Gray. Freddie, you're a Brit who's also spent a lot of time in America. Do you understand the First Amendment, and do you think it's bonkers?
Well, I've never quite got my head around the American Bill of Rights, so I suppose I do think it's bonkers in a way. But while I'm pro-free speech, I'm not a free speech absolutist. I think when it comes to royal families, if you're going to have a royal family, they should not have absolute freedom of speech. They should know when to keep their mouths shut. Sadly, Prince Harry does not seem to know when to keep his mouth shut.
There's something a bit grating when you think about the process through which the First Amendment came about, to hear royalty criticizing those civil liberties. But maybe that gives us insight into Harry's thinking now. Perhaps in his mind he isn't really a prince anymore, like he once was.
Well, I dread to think what's going on in his mind. I think he's sort of been brainwashed by a kind of therapeutic culture. And a lot of people want to blame his wife for that. I'm not sure you can. I mean, it's quite funny, really, because when we launched The Spectator in America, we had a cover piece from Rod Liddell begging Americans to take Meghan Markle back. And now this week, Americans, including our Washington editor, Amber Athey, are begging Britain to take Prince Harry back. It's an unhappy marriage.
Well, perhaps they'll end up back in Canada. Perhaps some of this explains their feelings towards not all, but some of the press coverage of their movements, that Harry just doesn't actually understand freedom of the press.
I don't think he does. I don't think he understands a lot. A friend of mine made quite a good joke that he thought Harry was talking about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. But in fact, he realised, no, Harry was talking about free speech. And that sort of reflects quite what people think about Harry's intellect. It's limited.
It's not particularly polite to say this to a country that you've adopted, but as believers in the First Amendment, perhaps we should forgive him.
You can forgive him, Kate. I might.
Okay, jury's still out. And maybe Harry should be spending a bit more time on his own couples podcast, Archwell. I know you're an avid listener, Freddie, but as I understand it, they've only released one episode since its much hyped launch last year.
Every 5 minutes, I check my Spotify feed to see if the next episode has dropped, and I'm constantly disappointed.
Well, here's hoping they release a new episode for you soon. Thank you, Freddie. And that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel? Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching, and do join us again next week for The Week in 60 Minutes.